About a month ago, I joined a group of students and professors on what was supposed to be a simple fossil hunting trip in Utah. Or at least that is what we told everyone. But the truth is, we were not just looking for fossils. We were after something far more extraordinary, live specimens. If I had known the full extent of what lay ahead, I would have turned down the opportunity in a heartbeat. Honestly, I should have stayed in Oregon or pursued a thesis project in Wyoming, North Dakota, or even Australia. Instead, I ended up traveling back to the Cretaceous period, and nothing has been the same since. It all started when my professor, Dr. Anderson, reached out to me. She sent an email about an exciting thesis opportunity. During our last chat, we had discussed the evolution of flowering plants and the decline of gymnosperms during the late Cretaceous. She seemed eager to continue the conversation, but insisted we do it face-to-face, claiming email was not secure. When I finally met with her, I could not believe what she was saying. She explained that a group of physicists in Utah had made an extraordinary breakthrough, and we had been granted permission to join their project. At first, I thought she was joking, but her tone grew more serious as she pulled out a few papers. A non-disclosure agreement she had signed. It was enough to convince me to take the leap. Figured, why not? It was an opportunity to work toward my PhD. A month later, I was on a plane from Portland to Salt Lake City, and then, somehow, to the Cretaceous. The morning we left was brutal, 4 a.m., to be exact. On the drive to the university, I could not shake the feeling of déjà vu. My head was pressed against the cold window, vibrating with every bump in the road, just like when I used to ride the bus as a kid. Dr. Anderson sat beside me, upright as ever, her back ramrod straight. We arrived at an almost empty parking lot, dimly lit by a few flickering sodium lamps. As we pulled up, I glanced at Dr. Anderson, but she did not look back. Instead, she stepped out of the car, unbuckled her seatbelt, and started toward the side entrance of a large brick building. I scrambled to catch up as she walked briskly through a glass door propped open. We ended up in a small lecture hall buzzing with fluorescent lights. I hung back near the entrance while she moved forward without hesitation. It was clear we were not the only team here. A handful of students and professors were scattered around, and I recognized some of the university logos on their hoodies: Utah, Texas, Santa Cruz. The rest of the group wore plain, nondescript clothing. In total, there were 9 of us, including Dr. Anderson and me. The room went quiet as we entered, and I felt the weight of everyone's eyes on us. My face grew hot. I have never been great at meeting new people. Dr. Anderson headed straight for a group of professors and began introducing herself. I lingered awkwardly near the door, my hands fidgeting at my sides. Before I could decide what to do, a man in plain clothing approached me, his hand extended. "Hi there. I am Nate. And you are?" I quickly wiped my sweaty palm on my pants before shaking his hand. His grip was obnoxiously firm. I am Mike. Nice to meet you." He gave a slight nod. "Where are you from?" "From Oregon," I said. "What about you?" "I grew up in Washington," he replied. "But I guess I am more from everywhere these days. I am a journalist, not a student." "Oh," I muttered, unsure what else to say. Nate chuckled, a little too loudly for the early hour, and a few people nearby cringed. "If everything goes as planned, this is going to be history in the making. You should let me interview you before we head out. I am writing an article about this whole project." "You do not say," I replied, glancing at the other students, who were watching us from a distance. I had a distinct feeling I was being judged. Nate turned back to the others. "Come on. Let me introduce you to everyone." Before he could make a move, Dr. Anderson appeared beside us. She placed a firm hand on Nate's shoulder, making him flinch slightly. "Actually, I will take it from here," she said with a polite but icy smile. She led me toward a group of professors, introducing them as Dr. Collins, Dr. Meyer, and Dr. Parker. They each gave me a handshake and the usual polite pleasantries. I felt like a kid showing off a crayon drawing to distant relatives. "Oh, how nice. Very good." Once I could politely excuse myself, I made my way back to Nate. I think I preferred his overbearing personality to the awkward small talk with the professors. By now, Nate had gathered the other students, or as I should call them, candidates. As I joined them, I noticed that I was the odd one out. Everyone else wore hoodies or sweaters with their university logos. Nate grinned and clapped me on the back. "Hey, Mike. We were just talking about you." My stomach churned. "Oh yeah. Yeah. We were trying to figure out which school you are from," said one of the students. "I am from Oregon," I replied, raising a weak fist in the air. "Go Ducks." Silence. Everyone just stared at me, and I suddenly wished I could disappear. Here's the rewritten version of the second part of your story, adhering to your guidelines. As we talked, I learned a bit about the others. Cruz was another paleontology candidate, while Utah and Texas focused on astrophysics and geology, respectively. Before long, the smaller conversations merged into one large, buzzing group. That is when Dr. Chilton stepped forward to take charge. "Everyone, take a seat," he instructed. Without hesitation, we all sat down, except Utah, who walked to the front to stand beside him. I picked a cushioned chair and immediately started bouncing my leg, a nervous habit I could not seem to break. Dr. Anderson, sitting beside me, shot me a sharp look. I got the message and shoved my hands under my thighs to keep still. Utah handed out folders to each of us. When mine landed in my hands, curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. My name was printed right there on the first page. Seeing it made my stomach flip. Dr. Chilton leaned back against the podium behind him, his gaze sweeping over the group. "You all know why you are here," he began. "At this university, our physics and engineering teams have achieved a groundbreaking discovery. They have built a time machine. You will get to see it shortly. With this technology, we can travel back in time, specifically to 66 million years ago, the late Cretaceous period." He paused for effect, his eyes locking briefly with mine. "Each of you has been selected for a specific purpose. Some of you will collect plant samples, while others will observe astronomical events or study animal life. A few will gather geological data. Regardless of your assignment, there is one unbreakable rule. You must wear your suits at all times when outside the shuttle. These suits are designed to prevent microbial contamination of the past. Taking them off is strictly forbidden. Do you all understand?" We nodded in unison, the weight of his words settling over us like a heavy fog. Dr. Chilton launched into a long technical explanation of how the machine worked. Honestly, it felt unnecessary. Why did we need to know all that? Finally, he wrapped up by saying, "In your folders, you will find detailed objectives written by your mentors. These are your missions. Read them as we walk to the next building." I flipped open my folder as we stepped back into the cold morning air. Inside was a short note from Dr. Anderson. Her handwriting was neat but brisk, matching her personality. "Mike, we will likely encounter plant species unfamiliar to us, but we should recognize some of the larger families. Since you have shown such a keen interest in vascular plants, I want you to collect the following, if possible: 1 fern, 1 gymnosperm, and 1 angiosperm sample. We are traveling to the late Cretaceous, so angiosperms should be present. If not, collect the closest alternatives. Remember, whatever you bring back will shape the focus of your career. Choose wisely." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. The cold air stung my cheeks, and our breath hung around us like puffs of steam, lingering in the stillness. I reread the note a few times, mentally preparing myself. 1 fern, 1 conifer, and 1 flowering plant. Those were my targets. The walk was short, and soon we entered a new building. Inside, Dr. Chilton split us into 2 groups by gender, and we were led to separate rooms. Waiting inside was a group of people dressed in scrubs. It felt like being processed through some sort of assembly line. We were handed plain clothing, thin, thermal-like layers, and told to change. I kept my eyes on the wall, trying to avoid any awkwardness, and did as instructed. A man in scrubs collected my folded clothes and set them neatly aside. Then came the next phase. A team of scrubs-clad staff swarmed around us, fitting us into suits that resembled streamlined astronaut gear, but in a muted green. As the pieces clicked into place, I felt the weight of the small backpack they strapped to me. It housed a silver canister, and I could feel its cool presence against my back. The helmet was the strangest part. When they placed it over my head, the world suddenly went quiet, the sound around me muffled. I glanced at Nate, who was getting his helmet secured. My breath fogged up the visor briefly, but a nurse quickly adjusted something near my neck. A blast of air cleared the condensation, and I could see clearly again. There were more adjustments. Latches being tightened, straps pulled snug. Tiny screens flickered to life inside my helmet, showing grainy images of the room behind me, like a backup camera. I turned to Nate and gave a small wave. He waved back, his movements a little stiff in the bulky suit. Suddenly, his voice crackled in my ear through the comms. "Mike, can you hear me? Not too shabby, huh?" Ben's voice crackled through the comms, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned toward him, trying for levity. "I think I'm getting claustrophobic." One of the nurses paused to glance at me, their brow creased with concern. I waved them off, smiling under my helmet. "Just kidding. Keep going." The suit's capabilities were impressive. I could see behind me through tiny screens, communicate with everyone else in the suits, and monitor my oxygen levels. Still, the weight of it all, literally and figuratively, pressed on me. "What if we need to pee?" I blurted out, aiming the question at one of the nurses. The comms crackled with scattered laughter as I realized everyone had heard me. "There's a bathroom on the shuttle," Dr. Chilton replied, his tone dry but not unkind. "And a decontamination station for before you go back outside. We'll be there for about an hour. Emergencies only." We shuffled out of the room into a sterile, brightly lit hallway. Ben's voice cut through the faint hum of machinery as he posed the question that should have stopped everything. "What if we run into a velociraptor? Or a T-Rex? What if something tries to eat us?" The group stilled, tension coiling in the air. After a pause, Dr. Potter responded. "Unlikely. Velociraptors lived in Asia, not this region. We're heading to what is now Utah during the late Cretaceous. Expect a swamp, not a savanna. Our main concern is protecting the suits from damage." As we resumed walking, Ben pressed further. "Then what's Cruz supposed to observe? Isn't he studying animal life?" Cruz let out a huff. "If I can see anything, it's not just dinosaurs, you know. There are ancient invertebrates, fish, and more." His voice trailed off, and Ben's skeptical oof didn't help. Cruz's question came next. "What about you, Ben? What are you supposed to do?" Ben mimed holding a camera, his gloved hands clunky. "Document everything. Photos, notes, details. Same as always." I envied him for the simplicity of his task. We walked in silence until we reached a large, imposing silver door with a rotating wheel at its center. It looked out of place, like it belonged on a submarine. Doctors Chilton and Myers turned the handle together, pulling the door open with a low hiss. We filed through a short antechamber into a larger room. "Take your seats," one of the doctors instructed. The seats were lined along one side of the room, evenly spaced. 2 additional chairs were positioned at the far end. The walls were featureless metal, no windows, just stark functionality. "Is this the shuttle?" Texas asked, his suit creaking as he turned. "Yes," Dr. Jameson confirmed, sealing the door behind us. Her movements were brisk but deliberate, and her voice calm. She nodded toward a set of lockers on the far wall, divided by a low barrier. "Your equipment is in the far left locker." I nodded, committing the instruction to memory as I sank into the nearest seat. The metal armrests were cold against my gloved hands, but I let myself relax into them, imagining for a moment that I was an astronaut preparing for liftoff. I pushed away the thought of disasters like the Challenger. Cruz sat to my right, Texas further down. Ben was directly ahead, chatting with Utah over the comms about seatbelts. I glanced at the harness in my seat, a simple car seat style system with metal buckles. It wasn't what I expected for something as advanced as time travel, but I clipped myself in. Dr. Myers walked the aisle, checking each of our restraints. When he reached me, he pulled so hard on the straps that I winced. "I can't breathe," I muttered, but he didn't respond. Through the comms, I could hear someone breathing heavily, their nerves audible in every shaky exhale. My legs started bouncing again, but the straps kept them from moving much. Finally, Dr. Myers took his seat and buckled himself in. Dr. Chilton's voice crackled through the comms, cold and clinical. "Here's what's going to happen. I'll flip a few switches, press a few buttons, nothing for you to worry about. You may feel nauseous afterward. If you need to vomit, use the bathroom in the corner." He gestured to a curtained-off area. He continued, "During the trip, you'll feel yourself being tugged in different directions, like rolling around inside a box. This is normal. Keep your jaw clenched to avoid biting your tongue." We laughed nervously, though the humor didn't quite land. "Keep your arms close to your chest," he added. I crossed my arms tightly, holding on to myself for comfort. Finally, his tone grew even flatter. "We're going to turn off the comms during the trip. The distortion would make it unbearable. It will be unsettling, but remember, we're all still here." By a show of hands, "Is everyone ready?" We all raised our hands. Some trembled. "Intercoms off in 3, 2, 1. Dr. Chilton's voice vanished, leaving only the sound of my own breaths and the soft hiss of air in my helmet. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment, I wondered if I was in over my head. I'd like to think we all watched as Dr. Chilton flipped switches, but I can only speak for myself. His movements were methodical, almost too calm. He paused, fumbling with a key, inserting it into a panel. With a deliberate twist, he pressed a button, and we were gone. The first sensation was the crushing force pinning me to my seat, like being in a jet during takeoff. A loud hum began, so deep and pervasive that it seemed to vibrate through my bones. My gloved hands gripped the armrests as the pressure increased. Suddenly, the room jerked left. A cry echoed faintly in my helmet. Someone had shouted, but the source was indistinguishable. The hum grew louder, resonating through the metal chair, making my head buzz. Another sudden jolt, this time to the right, sent Cruz's arm flying into my peripheral vision. I closed my eyes, desperate to center myself. Big mistake. Vertigo hit me like a tidal wave, spinning my senses into chaos. I forced my eyes open just as the shuttle spiraled into a barrel roll, the sensation like being caught in a giant drill tunneling through solid rock. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. Then, a sudden halt. My head snapped forward and back into the cushioned headrest. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was over, but none of the doctors moved. And then I heard it, a cracking sound. It came from the wall to my left, sharp and fragile like glass fracturing under immense pressure. I froze, holding my breath as the sound deepened. Then came the voice. "Please, please stay." It was faint, almost drowned by the vibrations. The words were pleading, desperate, as if coming from behind a sliding glass door. I turned toward the wall, my eyes straining to pinpoint the source. The crackling sound grew louder, but before I could make sense of it, the shuttle shifted again. This time we slid. The sensation was unsettling, like hitting a patch of black ice in a car, smooth yet uncontrollable. The strange sound stopped, but the sliding continued for what felt like an eternity. Then, without warning, the shuttle jerked to a stop. The silence that followed was almost worse. I exhaled shakily and turned to Cruz. "Did you hear?" I gestured toward the wall with a thumb. Cruz looked confused. "What?" His voice was distant, muffled by the absence of the comms. The speakers crackled to life, jolting me from my thoughts. "We're lucky. That was a smooth ride." Dr. Chilton's voice was far too cheerful for my liking. I exchanged a glance with Cruz. "Smooth ride?" "Can we unbuckle now?" Texas asked. His voice carried a strain, as if the tight straps had squeezed the air out of him. "Sure, sure." Dr. Chilton waved his hands dismissively. Up, up, everyone. One by one, we fumbled with our restraints, shakily rising from our seats. Utah looked particularly green, swaying as he stood. "How do we know it worked?" Ben asked, still seated, his tone edged with skepticism. Dr. Chilton's smile was visible through his visor. "That's the fun part. You should grab your camera. Second locker from the left." Ben scrambled to the designated locker, yanking it open and pulling out a sleek camera with a large lens. His hands shook as he tried to assemble it, repeatedly fumbling the alignment. Frustration etched into his face. "Wait!" he exclaimed, holding up his hands. Abandoning the locker, he hurried over to me and shoved the camera into my hands. "Hold this." I froze, clutching the equipment with the delicacy of someone holding a live bomb. Ben fumbled with the lens again until, with a satisfying click, it finally docked into place. He snatched it back, pressing buttons rapidly. "Okay, I'm ready." Meanwhile, Dr. Chilton had moved toward the antechamber. "Vivienne, give me a hand?" Dr. Jameson nodded and joined him, their gloved hands grasping the wheel of the heavy door. I stayed back as the others surged toward the bottleneck, their helmets bobbing in my line of sight. "Say cheese." Ben pointed the camera at me. I didn't respond, my focus entirely on the door. The doctor strained, pulling the wheel with synchronized effort. The intercom filled with a burst of excited chatter. With a deep, echoing thud, the door unlatched. It swung outward slowly, revealing. They spilled out onto the wet, spongy earth in a chaotic wave of motion. A few stumbled, sending splashes of water into the air. Bright rays of sunlight streamed through the antechamber door, momentarily blinding me. I raised a hand to shield my eyes, letting them adjust before stepping into the late Cretaceous. It was breathtaking. Everywhere I looked, lush vegetation stretched in every direction. Ferns, cycads, and even what resembled pine trees competed for space, forming a dense, ancient tapestry of green. The air smelled rich and earthy, laced with the faint tang of water and decay. I stumbled forward, caught between awe and purpose. Then I remembered my tools. Weaving past Ben, who had his camera pressed to his visor, I reached the drawers where my collection equipment was stored. Inside were 3 canisters the length of my forearm, a hand spade, and a pair of pruning shears. Grabbing one canister and the spade, I rushed back out, eager to begin. The comms buzzed with overlapping chatter, the excitement palpable. I tuned it out, focusing on the task at hand. My eyes locked onto a small, tufted fern a few yards away. Its fronds were delicate, yet it stood resilient against the swampy backdrop. Dropping to my knees, I plunged the spade into the ground. The soil gave way easily, soft as butter. A thrill ran through me at the sensation. The roots of the fern resisted briefly before succumbing to my careful tugs, releasing with a satisfying crunch. I cradled the plant and gently lowered it into the canister. But it looked lonely in there, perched on the bare metal. Frowning, I tipped the canister, sliding the fern out, and scooped a generous layer of soil from the ground. Placing the fern back, I added a splash of water from a nearby puddle to mimic its natural habitat. It wasn't much, but I clung to the hope that it might survive the trip back. Returning to the shuttle, I bumped shoulders with Cruz, who was juggling short, squat canisters and nets. "Sorry," I mumbled, but he didn't reply. His focus was razor-sharp. I deposited the fern-filled canister and grabbed another, along with the pruners and spade, already planning my next find. The comms grew quieter as everyone settled into their tasks, punctuated only by the occasional exclamation of discovery. I stepped outside again, scanning the swamp canopy for something new. My gaze landed on a tree adorned with large, white flowers. Flowers meant pollen, an invaluable material to study. I hurried to the tree, the pruners slicing cleanly through the branches with a satisfying shick. I stuffed the flowers and smaller branches into the canister, ensuring I had enough samples to work with later. It was on my third trip outside that everything changed. I spotted a small gymnosperm sapling near the water's edge, no taller than a foot. It looked like a primitive pine, its delicate needles reaching skyward. I jogged over, knelt by its side, and began extracting it with practiced care. The spade cut through the soil and roots with ease, and I packed the muddy sapling into the canister. Then movement caught my eye. To my right, the water rippled unnaturally. My breath hitched. A tiny splash disturbed the surface, sending concentric waves outward. "Hey, Cruz," I said into the comms, my voice wavering slightly. "Yeah." His voice came back, winded from exertion. "There might be fish over here about 15 yards to the right of the pod. Where are you?" "I'm grabbing my last canister," he replied, his breaths heavy in my ears. "I'll see you in a few moments." Relieved, I stood up, holding the canister with the tiny sapling. I turned to wave in his direction, signaling where I was. That was my mistake. Cruz's helmeted head bobbed above the ferns and shrubs like a disembodied apparition. I raised my hand high, waving to help him locate me. As I did, my rearview camera caught movement. A ripple in the water. Looking back, I can't believe we thought a swamp was a smart place to land. What I saw in that grainy footage will haunt me forever, even though I didn't see it with my own eyes. A scaly ridge, over 20 feet long, broke the water's surface, gliding silently as if it were the ghost of the swamp itself. The ripple I'd noticed was the tail. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing, but my body reacted before I could fully understand. It was like being struck by lightning. My legs launched me forward as the water erupted. A 40-foot-long crocodilian burst from the depths, its massive jaws snapping shut in the exact spot I'd occupied just seconds before. I didn't even have time to scream. Two enormous, yellow eyes perched atop its head blinked once, readjusting their focus. The moment I managed to suck in a breath, I let out a scream that tore through the comms. Without a second thought, I clutched the canister tighter and hurled the spade behind me. I didn't look back, but the rearview camera told me all I needed to know. The creature, Deinosuchus, was on me. Its jaws gaped wide, revealing teeth like jagged stakes, and its massive forelegs churned through the swampy muck, propelling its bulk with terrifying speed. The ground trembled with its every step, vibrating through my boots as I sprinted. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered Dr. Jameson's lecture about ancient crocodilians, how bite marks on dinosaur fossils proved they preyed on creatures much larger than us. 7 tons of prehistoric predator, relentless and unstoppable. The mnemonic device for its name echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. Deinosuchus, terrible crocodile. Images flashed before me. Those massive jaws clamping down on my leg, dragging me back to the water, spinning in a death roll until my bones shattered. Or worse, swallowing me whole. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed into the underbrush. Cruz's wide-eyed face appeared ahead of me, equal parts terror and exhilaration. "Run, stupid!" I slapped his shoulder as I passed, and he took off alongside me. Behind us, the Deinosuchus barreled through the foliage, shredding shrubs and saplings like paper. "Deinosuchus!" I screamed into the comms, my voice breaking. "Deinosuchus in the water!" The radio exploded with panicked voices. "Deinosuchus! What's that? Is that the noise? Why is the ground shaking?" Cruz veered left, and I instinctively bolted to the right, hoping to split the predator's attention. Glancing at the rearview camera, relief flooded me as the Deinosuchus hesitated before pursuing Cruz. Guilt stabbed at me, but survival instinct pushed me forward. I adjusted my path, heading toward the others. The rumbling ground faded, replaced by the distant sound of snapping branches. I dropped the canister onto the spongy earth just as Dr. Jameson ran to meet me. "Are you okay? What happened?" Hands on my knees, I sucked in heaving breaths. Deinosuchus, I managed between gasps, ambushed me at the water's edge, followed Cruz away from the shuttle. What's a Deinosuchus? Utah's voice quivered over the comms. A prehistoric crocodile, Dr. Jameson replied grimly. Big enough to eat a T-Rex. Get away from the water. Utah paled behind her helmet, quickly retreating from the nearby pond. Cruz's labored breaths crackled through the comms, followed by a strained cry. Dr. Potter! Look out! Run! We froze. A weak scream echoed through the intercom. Then the swamp went eerily silent. I fumbled for the canister, but Dr. Jameson grabbed my arm. We need to get to the shuttle, she said, her voice sharp with urgency. No one hesitated. We scrambled toward the shuttle entrance, tripping over one another in our desperation to reach safety. Cruz's breathing filled the channel, but it was drowned out by the faint groans of Dr. Potter. Her voice was shaky, frantic. No, 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 no. Cruz? Somebody? A deep hiss reverberated through the comms, less than 50 yards away. No. Somebody. Please, help me. Her screams sliced through the silence, raw and primal. We surged into the shuttle, the doorway filling with panicked bodies. Behind us, the swamp erupted into chaos. My leg. It's got my leg, Dr. Chilto. A crack, sharp as a gunshot, sliced through the air, followed by a piercing scream that blurred the line between human and inhuman. The ground began to tremble again, and through the comms came the unmistakable sounds of a massive splash, bubbles bursting against the glass of Dr. Potter's helmet. Her screams continued, desperate and raw, any attempt at words dissolving into primal cries. We were all in the antechamber of the shuttle, frozen in collective terror. I clutched my canister so tightly my knuckles ached and squeezed my eyes shut. A tremendous rumble reverberated through the air, drowning out the faint, jerky cries that still leaked through the comms. They sounded wrong, disjointed, almost like a child's gurgling laughter when bounced on a parent's knee. Suddenly, Cruz stumbled through the shuttle's doorway. His mud-caked boots slapped against the floor as he staggered inside, prompting half of us to scream and the other half to backpedal instinctively. He didn't seem to notice. He trudged to his chair and collapsed, his chest heaving as he gasped for air, oblivious to the faint, broken groans of Dr. Potter still coming through the channel. In a daze, I set my canister down and reached for the shuttle door's handle. Dr. Jameson grabbed my arm, her grip firm and grounding. Is everyone inside? Her voice was eerily calm, like someone trying to hold back a flood. A few scattered affirmations echoed back. Together, we turned the wheel and heaved the door shut, locking out the harsh sunlight. The fluorescent glow of the shuttle's interior felt alien, sterile. We need to leave, Dr. Chilton said, his voice tense. Cruz nodded weakly from his seat, his body limp like a discarded rag doll. The rest of us stumbled to our chairs, fumbling with buckles and straps. My hands were trembling as I secured mine. Then, breaking through the tense silence, her voice returned over the comms. No, please, Dr. Potter. Faint, fuzzy, but undeniably her. Please don't leave. We froze, staring at one another in stunned disbelief. Potter, can you hear me? Chilton asked, leaning forward in his seat. Yes, she replied weakly, her words trembling. The signal was stronger now, clearer. Utah pressed a hand to her chest, holding back a sob. Can you make it to the door? Is the Deinosuchus gone? Chilton's voice wavered, but he kept his tone steady. A long silence followed before her response came, halting and resigned. No, it got me. Please don't leave. Her voice hitched, breaking into a low moan. I don't want to die alone. A watery scraping noise crackled through the comms, the sound chilling and unnatural, like nails on wet glass. The ground began to tremble again, faintly at first, then growing stronger. Her breathing, ragged and shallow, grew louder. Oh my God! Ben's voice quivered as he clutched the sides of his helmet. I think she's inside it right now. The comms filled with a sharp, broken sob, crystal clear and haunting. My stomach churned, and I hugged myself, willing the nausea to subside. The familiar cracking noise from earlier returned, but now it was slower, more deliberate. Her helmet was giving way, collapsing under the crushing force of the Deinosuchus's digestive system. Please don't leave me. Her voice broke into sobs, punctuated by wet, sickening sounds. Each crack was accented by a low groan, as if her body was being compressed from all sides. Her wheezing grew tighter, weaker, until finally, with a guttural, wrenching noise, her last word escaped. You. The comms went silent. A low, paralyzing crunch echoed through the shuttle walls, followed by a deep rumble from just outside. Beside me, Texas and Ben ripped off their helmets and turned away to vomit. I looked away, my own nausea surging, and stared blankly at the straps of my harness. Like a machine, I began fastening them, my hands moving on autopilot. When I finished, I found myself staring down at the small conifer still clutched in my hands. Is everyone ready to leave? Dr. Chilton asked, his voice hollow. One by one, we raised our hands. The comms cut off without another word. The trip back to the future was brutal. The shuttle's motion tossed us around, but no one spoke or made a sound beyond muffled sniffles. I held the plant close to my chest, its fragile branches pressing against my suit. When a faint cracking noise came from outside, I forced myself to tune it out. When we finally stopped, sliding back into our own time, silence filled the cabin. The comms flickered back on, and the sound of quiet sobbing emerged. First one person, then another. I took a deep, shuddering breath, but it broke halfway, and I dissolved into tears with the others. I should have said no. I should have taken a thesis opportunity in Wyoming or North Dakota or Australia. Anywhere but here. Instead, I traveled back to the Cretaceous, and I haven't been the same since.